Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, or I suppose good morning, depending on where you are. Welcome to the latest of our seminars. I hope you're all safe and well. My name is Mark Levy. I'm head of the English Programs team here at the British Council in Spain. And this webinar, as you can see from the title here, is on helping students process and understand texts, insights from reading test developers. It's the latest in our series of webinars for teachers in the bilingual program that we run alongside the Ministry of Education, the Ministerio de Educación y Formación Profesional, and the Comunidades Autónomas, the 10 regional governments who are part of the program. It's the first of our webinars for secondary teachers in a while, in fact. And as always, it accompanies the work that we're doing in our working groups in the program, looking at our approaches to literacy and to literature. We know, of course, that one of the biggest challenges facing teachers in the bilingual education program and in other bilingual programs, and probably at advanced levels of teaching across the world, is around the choice of texts and making relevant, authentic texts accessible. And this is true for both language teachers and obviously specialists in other subjects as well, using authentic texts in their biology, history, or geography lessons. This webinar, and the one that will follow in a few weeks, is aimed at addressing these issues, and in this case, looking at how we can use what we know from creating reading tests to show how we can support students at a cognition level as well as linguistically. To lead the session, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Victoria Clark. Vicky works for the British Council as a Global Assessment Solutions Manager. She was a teacher and a teacher trainer before moving into the field of language assessment, and her team works on projects with ministries around the world, providing solutions to their education and assessment needs. Also with us, but on off screen and answering some of your questions perhaps in the chat, is her colleague Mark O'Sullivan, and there are other colleagues there. So we will ask you, if you've got questions for us, especially questions for Vicky, obviously, can you write them in the Q&A, and they'll be passed on to me to ask Vicky later on at the end, towards the end of the session. So do use the chat, and as I said, some of the questions we'll answer in the chat as the webinar is ongoing. So I think that's it for introductions, and I'll just pass over now to Dr. Victoria Clark to take away the webinar. All yours.
Thanks, Mark. Can I just check you can see my slides?
Yep. Opening slide is on screen.
Lovely. Okay, so I'll start then. Thanks again, Mark. Okay, thank you everyone for attending this webinar. The purpose of this webinar is really to help us to understand how we as teachers can support students in accessing texts. Now, some of the texts for our students can be very challenging, either linguistically or conceptually, and in fact there are many other ways in which text can be challenging that we're going to talk about in today's webinar. I'm not just here to look at some strategies, although I will be focused on them a little bit later. What I'm here to do is try to give you some insights into the reading comprehension process so that you can understand the strategies that you use, where they fit in to that reading comprehension process and how they can actually assist. I come from a language teaching background, and we design and develop tests at multiple levels. And it's the insight that we use to design texts and tasks at different levels that I hope will be very useful for you in the classroom. So here's the contents of today's webinar. I'll be talking for just under 40 minutes, and then we'll be having a Q&A session. Please send in your comments or questions. My colleagues behind the scenes will give me those questions at the end. So first of all, I'm going to do a quick definition of reading, and then I'm going to explain to you what makes a good reader and what makes a not so good reader. And sometimes second language readers fall into that not so good. We're going to then talk about the reasons for reading and how that affects the reader. And then we go in part 4, we're going to talk about how we read, what actually happens when we read. Then we'll look at the characteristics that the reader brings to the reading process and how that affects reading. And then, of course, we'll look at textual features and how that affects the reading comprehension with our students. And then finally, we'll talk about how that all relates into the strategies that we have used ourselves in the classroom, or you haven't used yet but might be of use. And I've got a couple of example texts that some teachers have sent in to me. Thank you very much for that we're going to look for examples. So let me jump straight in. Okay, let's define reading, everyone. Okay, a very obvious statement. Reading is a complex ability, but what's important about this definition, everyone, is that the definition includes extracting meaning. That's really important because, as we know as teachers, whether it's first or second language in the classroom, when our students read, they can sometimes see the words, they can sometimes understand the words, understand the sentences, but at the end, they haven't extracted the meaning of the text. They haven't got the point of the text. Why is that? And hopefully I'm going to answer that today and show how we can actually help them to do that. That's a very common problem. There's many reasons for it, and as I said, we'll go through that today. The other important point in this introduction, and it's the main part of my webinar, is that reading depends on a dynamic interaction of three elements, if you wish: the reader, the text, and the cognitive processes that the reader engages while reading. I'll go through each one of those in turn today, but keep in mind that all of these are interdependent, all of these work together in order to reading to take place. I'm going to make some obvious statements about the difference between first language and second and third language learners and reading, but I think that they're quite important to note. Obviously, in second and third language, there is possibly not so much vocabulary and grammatical knowledge as they have in their first language. They also may not have had the quantity of text that they would have had in their first language. So the amount of text and also the different types of text, the different genre of text may also be much less in their second, third language. And then they come from obviously different cultural backgrounds and have different knowledge, background knowledge. So that may affect obviously and cause problems with the reading process. And we're going to come back to that throughout the texts, throughout the webinar. Okay, let's start. What makes a good reader? Well, first of all, a good reader sets goals. This is really important to note, that a good reader approaches texts in different ways depending on what the purpose of the reading is or what they want to get out of that reading. And that's really important because that means that they're strategic and they have a plan and they're selective. And also a good reader decodes and passes quickly. What does that mean? Well, first of all, it means that they recognize words on the page quickly and accurately. And then they understand how the words in a sentence, how they build together to form meaning, okay? And how this sentence then relates to the next sentence and then relates to the previous sentence. So that's what I mean by decoding, passing. And they do it in speed and accurately, okay? And here's very important, because this is the bit where we have to distinguish between readers who read the words but don't understand the text and readers who read the word and extract that meaning. When they're reading, at the same time as basically they're decoding and looking at the linguistic elements, they're also making predictions. What's going to happen next? What should occur? Why did he do that? This is probably the case here. How does that relate back to what I've just read earlier? They're constantly making predictions, like a guessing game of what's coming next. And they're looking for clues in the language and in the text to try and justify or to confirm their hypotheses. And they're using all the knowledge they have from the world that they've lived in, experienced, in order to gain that, extract that meaning from the text. And as they're going along, they ask themselves questions in their head. Well, why is this? Is this correct? What does this mean? What have I understood? And they sometimes summarize, paraphrase, just to make sure they're understanding. Or if they don't, they probably go back. That's a good reader. That's what probably we do in our first languages. Okay, so what makes a not so good reader? And all of these I'm going to explain in more detail throughout the webinar, so Don't worry about that. Well, first of all, they don't set goals. They do approach texts possibly in the same way, regardless of the type of text, the genre, the purpose. It means they're not very strategic, right? And here's the problem. They have problems even at the linguistic level of decoding. The word recognition might be slow, the grammatical, the syntactical, understanding the grammar may be difficult, understanding how the words fit in the sentence and how they relate to the next sentence might be difficult. Now, that could be a language issue, of course, for second language. And here's the problem with that. If we're struggling at that level of the decoding, so the linguistic level, it's very difficult to then add background knowledge and make those higher level, those deeper thinking and reading skills of add background knowledge, reflect, predict. It's quite difficult to do that because they're so engrossed in the linguistic, it's taken up all the room in their working knowledge, in their working memory. And they can't have room to do the higher level actual work. That's the reason why they read the text, but they don't extract the meaning. And again, don't worry, this is going to come back and back and back throughout this webinar. And they don't reflect, they don't think, they don't ask themselves questions as they go along, and they often don't get to the end of a section and try and think what's just been, what they've just read. So that's the novice. So our goal is to help those novice readers gain some of those skills that the expert reader has. So, okay, how do we do that and what's the plan? So let's start with the reading purpose. We talked about goals, setting goals. It was my first point in the expert reader. If we want the reader to set a goal and be strategic, then we have to tell them why they're reading. We have to explain what the text we have in front of us is for. What is it that we want them to get from that text? What is it we want them to do with that text? Why are they reading it? It's only in the classroom that we sometimes do reading and listening with no goals. There's no way in the real world would I not read or not listen, for example, without a purpose. And without that purpose, it's very difficult for them to say, okay, she only wants me to get the topic. So, okay, I don't need to read all the details. When people say to me, is this text difficult for my students? I don't even ask who the students are. My first question is, what's the purpose? Now, I'm a beginner in Spanish, and a very difficult text, so long as the purpose is for me just to get some the time or the cost or the general topic, it's not difficult for me. But obviously, if you give me a very difficult text and you want me to understand the writer's intention and purpose, etc., or some of the details, then it might be too difficult for me, obviously. So these graphics below, I'm just, my colleagues have done these for me. What they're trying to say is, if I'm reading a detective novel, everyone, which is reading for pleasure, it's going to be a different way to approach the text than if I'm reading a textbook, like a history textbook, for exam the next day. Very different ways of approaching that text because I have very different goals in mind and purposes. So without giving a really clear indicator of the purpose, the goals, what we want to get out of it, why, before we start, then they can't set those goals. Okay, so here are some reasons that reading for information, I'm not focusing on reading for pleasure in this webinar, but here are some of the ideas. I mean, there's many reasons we read, but obviously if you look at the first one, reading to get an overview, and then you look at, say, the one 6 down or something to get a detailed and critical understanding, that's a very different purpose, different purposes. And the top one, we could have quite a difficult text, and it could be easily accessible to the students because of that purpose. So we have to think of the purpose. Okay, so how do we read? All well and good saying what are we reading and why, but what actually happens when we read? Well, we've got two ideas here. Okay, in the research, what it basically says is there is bottom up processing when we read and there's top down processing when we read. In reality, these are in parallel. They happen together mostly, okay? And I'm going to show you later on an example where you're going to do that. But just bear with me while I go from bottom up. So from bottom up, the idea is we see the words on the page, the graphemes, that's basically the written representation of phonemes. So let's say the words, the letters on the page, and then we recognize the word, and then we assign meaning to those words, and then we do this, if you remember this, I mentioned before, this parsing. So let me explain a bit more. Okay, give you an example. The wife killed her husband. Okay, who's dead? Well, we know the husband's dead because the husband comes after the verb. That's what sort of syntactic parsing, okay, in a nice example for the women out there. A semantic idea, a semantic parsing is perhaps use the word believe. If I have the word to believe, I know that only animate, living objects, living people can believe. A table doesn't believe, right? So if I see believe, I know it's a human or perhaps an animal. So that's what I mean. When we see the words in the sentence, we look at the grammar, the structure, and the meaning of those words, put them together to extract that meaning, and then we look at the next sentence and see how that's connected, and then we link it to the sentence before and we extract meaning. So that's how we're starting. Then we go and look at the context. What happened before? Who are these people? Where are they? What's the situation? And with that, we go slightly beyond the lines to, we go beyond to try and make meaning. So not just the literal meaning of the sentence, but what's it actually mean? And then, again, in this bottom-up approach, we add the background knowledge. So what we know about the world, what we've learned at school, what we know about the topic, what we know about our cultures, the society. Discourse knowledge is what we know about how a text is structured. And here's a really important concept of schemata. Schemata is basically how we learn and how we read effectively. Schemata is like little packages of knowledge. We have a schemata for making a sandwich, one for going to a restaurant and getting a meal. So you go in the door, you ask for a table, you sit down, you get a menu, you order food, you ask for the bill, you pay, you leave. We have schematas for everything, dealing with difficult parents at school, for example. And it's those packages of knowledge that when we start reading, they're activated, and that means we can start the predicting what might happen next, reflecting on what's actually been written. Is it something that makes sense to us, or is it new that we have to add into that knowledge package? Look, for example, of a child, okay? A child sees a very cute puppy. That's a dog. Then the child sees later on a very angry, aggressive dog, but that's also a dog. Now, the idea is that they recognize it's a dog because it also has 4 legs and a tail and it barks, but it's added to their package of knowledge, and now that's added to the concept of dog. And so when they read in a book, John ran away from the dog, they know that he's not running away from this puppy because that wouldn't make sense. But because they have that knowledge, that schemata, that package of knowledge, so that's basically how we read and learn, because we add new information to our own our schematas, and then we build more knowledge. So that helps. But here's the problem. If I'm really focused on that bottom bit, the linguistic knowledge, then I have very little time to activate the schemata, think about so subconsciously we do it obviously naturally in the first language, look at the topic, what I know about the topic and the culture and what I've experienced, what I've seen before, what I've read before. It's very difficult to activate that top-down part because I'm focused on the bottom-up approach, right? And because my working memory is limited capacity. That's why activating background knowledge is absolutely essential in the classroom for students who may be struggling with the linguistic elements, because by activating that knowledge, when they start processing from the bottom, so decoding and parsing, that activation that you've done previously is going to help them to decode. It's already helping them to reflect and to predict what that might be. So that's really important. So here's an example for you to show you what I'm talking about. Read this sentence. Okay, it's a simple sentence, and all of you no doubt have understood it perfectly, but let's look at the sentence, because theoretically, what the sentence could mean, everyone, is that the policeman held up his hand like this, like he's doing in the picture, and then magically that hand made the car stop. Okay, like Harry Potter like. So some sort of magical powers. Now, no one thought of that, because obviously you've used, as you were reading, your top-down knowledge was activated. What was activated? First of all, policemen are often stopping people in cars because they're at, in motorways, it could be accidents, they could be checking ID, especially in today's COVID times, going from region to region. Okay, we know that, right? Secondly, we also know that when a policeman holds up his hand, you stop, otherwise you'll be in big trouble. So we also know that, right? And we also know that policemen are safe in our countries, for example. So we're not frightened of them, unless you've had a few drinks, perhaps. But the idea is, as you were reading this very simple sentence, your knowledge was activated in parallel for you to extract meaning from that sentence. So let's have a look at a slightly more complicated model or graph of what I was just saying. So we've got top down, bottom up. Bottom up, so from the visual, the words on the page, we recognize the word, we access the meaning of that word, because some words have many meanings and in sentences they may change. Then we do this we look at the grammar of the sentence, make sure we understand who's doing what to where, and etc. And then we get to that propositional meaning, means the literal meaning. So what the sentence actually says. And then once we look at the context and the situation, we get to understand the real meaning of that sentence. Okay, what do I mean by that? Okay, I'll give you an example. If I said to my husband, do I look fat in this dress? And then my husband says, I prefer the blue one, okay? The propositional meaning is his preference of the dresses is the one that is of a color blue, but that's not what he means, right? Okay, now he's said something, but he's inferring that yes, that dress does make you look fat. The reason he hasn't said those words is because he wants to live, but that's the difference between propositional meaning and, you know, what is he actually saying? So you add context with the wife, husband context, it's pretty clear what he's what the real meaning is. And again, that's how we then add the situation, our background knowledge, and we start to get the real meaning. Let's go up. As we're going up, now this is the important part, right? This is the part where we separate reading the words and understanding the words, but not understanding the text. This is what you need to do to understand the text. So we've got the words, we've got the sentences. Now what we have to do is keep those words and the ideas of, so keep the ideas of the sentences in our head. Then the next sentence we read, we add that to what we've got in our head and we think about it. Okay, that's an additional bit of information, that's an opposite idea, that's giving me more description. And we're forming a mental representation of that text in our head. It's only when we have a representation of the text in our head can we really extract meaning. Otherwise, we're just reading the sentence, reading the next sentence, reading the next sentence, reading the next sentence. We can't keep it in our head. So that's why we're not extracting the meaning of the text as a whole. Okay, we might just remember what we've read in the last few sentences. Now, why do our students do that? Let me go back to what I said earlier. If they're struggling at the linguistic level, all their working memory capacity is working really hard for the language, so they don't have that luxury of that top down that should be in parallel and, you know, activating schemata, thinking about how it relates to their own experience, etc. And therefore they can't build that picture in their heads to get that text as a whole and to extract meaning of the text. Okay, now remember I said that reading is sort of an interaction, dynamic interaction between how the cognitive processes, the reader, which is where we're coming to now, and the text. Let's look at the reader. A lot of these things overlap. I'm going to repeat a lot of things because they all sort of overlap. Well, the reader brings with them skills and knowledges, right? And one of the skills they have is cognitive, their attention, their memory. Now, let's talk, for example, attention. We have students, right, who read, but they can't really read a large amount of text. They sort of get bored, or they lose their attention because they're not used to it. It's like going to the gym, right? If you go every day, I don't think it's that painful, she says, not knowing. But if you went every 6 weeks, I'm sure that would be very painful, because like exercise, reading is a skill. The more you do it, the better you are at it, right? So they may have not so great reading skills, and they may not be used to reading long text. Or again, the memory idea here, if they're struggling and they're trying to decode, then it's very difficult to add that background knowledge. So their working memory. Now, working memory is where we store information and manipulate it. So when you're reading, you should keep the idea of what's been read before in your head. And then what I mean manipulate is when you read the next bit, you add it to that. So how does that relate to what I've just read? What's happening? Okay, first they talk about this, then they're talking about this. Okay, but I'm keeping that mental representation, hopefully. But if I'm really working hard in the language, I can't. Now, and that then relates to the linguistic skills. What about their language skills? How quickly and accurately can they recognize words? How well can they break down those sentences when the words put together to make sense of those sentences and how they fit together? How good are they at looking at unfamiliar words and guessing what they might be? You know, how good are they at looking at, this is a root, this is a suffix, this is a prefix? That's a skill, right? And again, something that can be through practice, or it could be if you're linguistically minded, or if you have several languages, you might be able to infer words better. It's a reader characteristic. And of course, how interested are they? How motivated? Now, if I don't know why I'm reading, if there isn't something that might hold my interest, like a question that I have to answer at the end of the text, like what was a surprising thing you learnt about women? That's a question I'm going to ask about one of the texts we're looking at later. Then why would they read? Why would they be interested? So we also have to help them with their motivation. So by going back to this idea of purpose, giving them a purpose, a reason for reading, an idea to read, we might actually increase their motivation. By activating background knowledge, we will help them in the decoding. So we will help them to put that top down as they're going bottom up. In a text, which is my topic, I'll probably just start top down, right? Because as soon as I read the title and it's something I know well, everything's activated. If it's scientific text, say for myself, then obviously I might start with a bit of a bottom-up approach, because I don't know the words, I don't know the concepts. But hopefully, because I'm a very good reader, I will be trying desperately to predict and struggle in my mind about any scientific knowledge I might have, which no doubt is very little. But that's the idea. We have to help people. They also bring knowledge. What have they learnt before in school? What have they experienced? What schematas do they have? What do they know about the topic? What do they know about these types of texts? What I mean by discourse, let's take a narrative or a description. These are going to be easier to process than exposition or argument, right? Because obviously, if we ever say a biography, we all know how that looks. Start with when you were born, end with when you're dead. A little bit about your personal, a bit about your professional, etc. We all know where so that discourse knowledge is pretty clear. But if it's an unusual text, or that the text is not very structured, then it's an issue. Okay, so we've got cognitive processes, we've got the reader. What about the text? Now, I think this is the easiest one for us to understand. If the topic is familiar, it's going to be easier theoretically. It's not just about the vocabulary, it's also about the density of the vocabulary, how much information is in that text as well. If it's, let's say, what's nice and easy to process? A nice, easy text to process is one which has one main idea, which they develop throughout the text, They give loads of examples, explanations. There's a lot of cohesion and coherence. So in other words, there's a lot of discourse markers, for example, or another reason why the Civil War occurred is, or in addition to. We also find that, in the last paragraph we looked at, now we're going to move to, these texts don't really exist in our real world, but that would be easy to process. And that's that sort of, that cohesion side. What type of genre is it? And, is it a lab report? Is it, as I said, a biography? What is it in terms of the text? And that discourse style, I mean, narration, description, exposition, for example, argument, there's plenty more, but they're the four main ones. Okay, so how does that all fit together? Well, basically, I'm just looking at my time, making sure I'm okay for time. Basically, we want them to set goals. We want them to be able to think about why they're reading. So, for example, here's a text. I want you to, from this text, I hope you understand the 6 main reasons why the Civil War in England occurred. Okay, and we want to build background knowledge and help them to relate that knowledge to the text. This is vitally important, and I'm going to give you an example of how we can do that with a very difficult text in a minute. Remember, if they're struggling at the linguistic or conceptual level, then they don't have that capacity to add that top down, which is what we need to build the mental representation, which we need to extract meaning from larger pieces of texts. Yeah, otherwise we just read the words, and the chances are they'll just remember the last few sentences or the last paragraph they read, other than the entire text, which is what you're obviously needing. Clearly, vocabulary, pre-teaching vocabulary is essential in some reading tasks if the vocabulary is not familiar and is important for the purpose. Everything goes back for the purpose. If you want them to, for whatever purpose, to read the text, and those vocabulary items are not going to help them with that purpose, then my question is, why would you pre-teach them? Also, if the word could be guessed for whatever reason, similar to their own language, clearly roots being used in many words before, then again, I wouldn't pre-teach because I would hope to try and improve their skills, and then obviously check later that they have understood them. This is the important bit at the last part. Mapping out text structure. This is where I think teachers miss quite a lot in order how they can look at text and help. Sometimes texts have multiple paragraphs and they go all over the place. And I've got an example of that as well. In other words, they start with this idea, then they move to this idea, they don't fully divert that idea, then it comes to another idea, and they might go back to the other idea. And okay, now that itself, remember, we've got the decoding, the context situation, the activation of the knowledge we have. And when you start adding problems in terms of the structure of the text and how it's actually organized, we add another whammy, another problem for the students. A simple idea of going to the board, just writing down, like in the first paragraph, they're going to focus on this. In the second, but like just a string of what they might be working on in each of those paragraphs or sections, so that when the student approaches the text, that part is clear. They don't have to go, oh, hang on a minute, we just read this, and hang on a minute, we just read that, which is what I did with one of the examples I'm going to use today. So it's just a basic, in the text we have two of the texts, just looking at the paragraph, what's the topic, what are they really focusing on, just one word perhaps, or 2 words, and that will help them to actually follow the text, as well as the background knowledge and the vocab. So text structure, and I'm going to focus on that quite a bit in the 2 examples. And then strategies. If you're going to obviously help them with strategies, model the strategies. Do it yourself in front of the class, how you would do it. Now, remember, we're trying to go back to how an expert reader reads, right? So if we've looked at the vocabulary and the concepts, we've activated the background knowledge, then clearly, as they go through the text, we want them to ask questions. Now, obviously, you can write some of those questions on the board. Why do you think this happened? Or what do you think will happen next? I mean, and hopefully as they read, they'll be able to answer those questions as they go along the text. But it gives them, you know, it gives them a point where they're strategically trying to monitor their own comprehension. And at stages or at the end, getting them to summarize, paraphrase, whether it's in a group, on their own, etc. In pairs is quite good because they may have different understandings of the text, and they might have to go back and just try and work out which one's correct, or if they're, or neither of them are correct, perhaps. So the idea is, if we have a strategy we want to use, is to actually model that ourselves. And the read, ask, paraphrase is what the good readers do, right? They read, they ask themselves questions, they monitor, they check their comprehension. And do not assume students have those skills and strategies. They need to be, they can be, and in many respects they should be explicitly taught. So what about after? Well, obviously we want to check. We want to check that they have understood. Now, you can do many things there. We can obviously ask questions, get the students to ask questions. But to be honest, it's great if we've already got the questions in advance, so that they can focus on when they read, give them a purpose, give them an interest, give them a reason, give them a goal. And then you can check, obviously, the comprehension through those questions. And if there's questions at the end of the text, don't assume that the students will understand the purpose of those questions at the end of the text. You need to explicitly explain them at the beginning. Like, one of the questions is going to ask you about the general idea of the text, which means that if they're strategic, they might want to quickly read it first, and then just to understand, get that question right, and then they can go back and look at it for more detail. And then review the strategies you've used and discuss some of those difficulties. But again, that background knowledge is vitally important, and the graphic organizers, in terms of visualizing or with a simple chart, lines, etc., either how the text was structured, where the information was, how it's related, etc., is going to be quite an important, I think, element for teachers to help students process text. So let's look at a couple of examples. And thank you very much to the teachers who, I won't embarrass myself and pronounce your names. I think Jose and Jose Chu, apologies, my Spanish is A2 on a good day. I am studying, but as you can see, not the best of students. So let's start with the ice cream farm that one of our teachers has sent in. Don't worry if you haven't read it. I'm just going to explain some of the problems I have with this text based on what we've talked about, and hopefully you'll be able to read it later and see if you agree with me. It's a short text. On the surface, it looks quite simplistic. I don't think there's too much to pre-teach. I'm assuming they're economics students. I'm assuming they know the words cost, warehouse, etc. already. But that's not my problem. My problem with this text is the amount of information on different things throughout the text. So throughout the text, let me explain. In this text, they talk about where the farm is based, who they sell it to, the specialized production lines, quality control, their use of computers, the amount produced, the number of workers, the costs, the price. So in this extremely short text, they go through huge amounts of different information very swiftly. Even one sentence, there's 2 bits of different information at one point. But there's one sentence, then another bit of information. There's no explanation, no clarification. And in fact, at one point, they talk about something and they refer to it later on, which is a bit confusing. So how would I approach this? Well, the first thing I'll do is, I don't know what the purpose is for this text, and I'm not saying you shouldn't use it, far from it. I'm saying you can use any text if it's for the right purpose and you can make it accessible. So to make this text accessible, because I had to read it 2-3 times and I shouldn't really have to do that, I would need to actually have some clear questions at the beginning. For example, why do you think production increased? Now, the answer is in a couple of the paragraphs. One is that they have a specialized production lines. They also used computers, introduced computers. They focus on quality control. So I'm assuming that is the reason. Okay. Also, you might want to say, tell me, what's interesting about the costs? Now, that's a very open question, right? For me, what was interesting about the costs is that the massive costs was the cost of the workers, and hopefully that will bring the conversation to the fact that they increased production, but they didn't increase their workforce. So the changes they made have obviously are very important. Now, I'm not an economic student. This is just someone from me. So apologies from a very linguistic background, but how I see the text. So by asking two very short questions, I focus their reading and I get what I want from the students from that text. Now, the next text we've got here, this is completely different, everyone. This is a really difficult text language-wise. So it's a great example for me to use. Very interesting text, okay? But here's the problem. The language is, wow, there's loads of new vocabulary items here, no doubt. Even for a first language reader, this is a very difficult text. Again, I'm not saying don't use it. How do we make it accessible? Well, here is the perfect example of activating background knowledge, which will then help them to read the text, like the decode. So we're talking Charles V here, and excuse me if I'm for any history teachers if I'm wrong, but let's take the dates of 1500 to 1558, right? That's Charles V. So just writing that date on the board, I would just like to say, ask the students, what do we know about those? What happened in these dates? What do we know what's before? Now, I'm hoping what's just before would be the end of the Muslim rule, the fall of Granada, the Catholic monarchs, Christopher Columbus happened just before. Obviously, in that time, we're talking about the empire, okay, the Americas. Again, let's dig a bit deeper. Why did we go to the Americas? Why did the Spanish go to the Americas? You know, what was their real reason? What other reasons did they have? Obviously, we're thinking obviously gold, money, and we're also thinking, you know, conversion to Christianity. Okay, how did that work out for the indigenous people? Okay, clearly not so well. And then we might talk a bit further about, okay, let's think about royal families. What's some of the main issues that the royal families have had in the past? What was their real priority, royal families? Obviously to keep power. How did they do that? Well, they needed money, of course. They needed hopefully loyal citizens, but they also needed sons. And again, hopefully when they start thinking about this idea of the bloodline, the sons, the heirs, okay, that we were going to stimulate some conversation about that. And then you can perhaps move on to how were women in this sort of, looking at the dates, how were women treated? What about royal women, do you think? Again, we're activating their knowledge. It doesn't mean they're going to be correct. Now, I'm assuming they're going to say, well, women didn't have too many rights there. Okay, so now we've activated the background knowledge. And I think the third paragraph is about the exploitation and enslavement of the indigenous persons, the indigenous civilizations, and the sort of the idea that they will be kindly converted to Christianity, which didn't really work out for them. And then the division of, well, dividing his kingdom, if you wish, or the lineage. He gave his brother Austria so that it would have like one bloodline to ensure heirs. We've already talked about that before we even read the text. And then hopefully as we read, we'll find something surprising. And again, here's where I'd like some questions as well. Activate knowledge and questions. One of the questions I would have had is, what surprised you from the text? Now, there's many answers. I mean, some people may not have realized some aspects that perhaps Sicily was part of the Spanish kingdom at the time, or that Austria belonged for a short period of time. But hopefully somebody might also say, for example, women had political power. Who knows? So the idea is we background knowledge and we ask questions, not just for the yes, no and detailed questions, but questions that will again then go and inspire us to rethink our knowledge and add to that knowledge. And the schemata that we have around women in the royal family, I didn't realize that they were used in political function as governors in that time. So I've added to my schemata. So next time I approach a text around this period or etc., I'll be able to predict perhaps some more information. So the idea is we use what we know about the reading process, and we can hopefully help them to access the texts, you know, in an easier way. Now I'll stop talking there. So I don't know, am I 1 second? I'm supposed to, yeah, thank you, Maureen, for doing that. And we've got about 10-15 minutes for questions or comments.
Yep, I've got some. Thanks, Vicky, very much for that. That was really interesting. You've covered an awful lot of ground there. I think maybe one thing that might be worth just commenting on very briefly. I mean, it's obviously implicit, but if we go back to the very title of the webinar, you know, it's insights from reading test developers. Do you want to make that connection maybe a little bit more explicit about how this comes from design tests?
Yeah. So of course, yeah, it's a good point actually, Mark. I've implied it. The idea is that when we have reading texts, we know about the textual features and we can manipulate those in order for them to be more or less difficult. So at a lower level, for example, and we assess foreign language speakers in English. So at lower levels, for example, I'd have topics which are familiar, but from a B2 level, we would go to non-familiar topics. So we manipulate the textual features. A very structured paragraph would be used for, say, lower levels, but once you get to the C level in language ability, the upper levels, then it doesn't matter that we can have a text like the Charles V or the other. The structure, because they should have, because they're not going to struggle at the linguistic coding level. They're going to be able to access from the top. And if you look at the cognitive processes, again, we don't really design texts that have inferencing until we get to about B1. So the A1, A2 and low B1, we ask questions only at the propositional, the literal meaning. We don't try to get them to read between the lines. That's a skill that comes a bit later. And textual representation is at a B2 level. So that's why if your students aren't B2 level, which is high intermediate, you know, IELTS 5.5 to say 7, then they're going to have a struggle with that mental representation. And then with reader characteristics, they're the difficult bits in testing. We can't, but we have to also be, you know, conscious of the fact that people bring in different skills, and we have to make sure that we don't do bias for gender, for ethnicity, for culture, etc., etc. So that's where the insight comes. We use everything we know about the reading comprehension to help us design tests, if that makes sense.
No, it does, and of course that's absolutely crucial in a context which is true of, you know, most of the schools I know in Spain, which is, you know, many schools where a lot of teachers write their own tests, and very often don't get the results that they're expecting to, quite possibly because the test is either too easy or too difficult, or the questions are too easy or too difficult for the text that's being used, etc., etc.
Can I just say that if they're interested in trying to understand what's the difference between B1 and B2 and A1 and A2 reading, in terms of those cognitive processes, in terms of the linguistic elements, etc., they can actually look. We have a technical manual for APTIS, one of our tests, and at the back, in the appendix of that technical manual, and we can send that to you, in the appendix, we have all the test specifications for the individual reading tasks. So the reading task at A1, the reading task at A2, the reading task at B1 and B2. And in the test specifications, we actually explicitly state the cognitive processes, the functions, the vocabulary range, the grammatical range that those actual tasks need. So we actually spell that out for you. And it might be useful for when you're designing tests at that sort of, perhaps at the proficiency levels.
Yeah, I think it will be useful, and it's useful even at a low stakes test. It doesn't have to be high stakes, because you want to be sure that the test that you're writing achieves what you think you're trying to achieve, what your aim is to achieve.
Absolutely.
That's true. We've got a number of questions in. One of the questions is, you said, well, I'm paraphrasing a little bit what you said. You said, a good reader approaches texts in a different way, in a more strategic way than a less effective or a more novice reader, I think is the word to use. A lot of people might be better readers in their first language than they are in a second language. Are there ways that we can help learners transfer skills strategies they already have from a first language into a second language? Is that possible?
There's a big debate about this. One of the concepts we read is called the short circuit hypothesis by someone called Clark. I remember the name because it's my name, but with an E at the end, and I can't remember the date. Apologies, the name is obviously clear. Now, the short circuit hypothesis says that you need to be at a certain proficiency level in order for you to be able to transfer your reading skills over. Now, I think that they claim it's around about a B2. Now, I'm not sure. I'm not sure about that. Again, it's a hypothesis. It hasn't been proven. It's you know, and obviously a lot of the research on that is a bit, you know, the methodology may be questionable. But I think what we do know is it's not a given. It's not a given. My husband, for example, is a Spanish learner, and he's obviously very proficient in reading in his first language. But my God, does he struggle in reading very simple, shockingly simple Spanish, whereas I obviously am very proficient in my first language, but I also have multiple other languages. I have a French mother, I did Latin at school. So my reading ability is very advanced for my level, if that makes sense. You know, I can read quite difficult texts because I'm great at the, you know, unfamiliar words. But for students in school, so non-adults, I don't think they're able to easily transfer those strategies over. So I think we can assume that a good read in the first language at school is not automatically going to have the skills automatically transferred. And
which is why we need to
vocabulary, grammar, cultural background, discourse.
Which comes back to your point about why we need to spend the time in the classroom on actually working on the strategies explicitly as well as implicitly. And I suppose there's a question there about how we prioritize time we spend on reading in class. Where do we, you know, the teachers have a limited amount of time for everything that they do. Is there would you say that, you know, you'd spend much more time on the strategies than actually on the reading, or more time on the strategies than on the language, the linguistic elements? I mean, is there something there?
I think a lot of teachers sometimes feel quite redundant while their students read. For me, whether it's about, for me, it's all about but in some ways, by actually focusing on the background knowledge, you know, trying to activate that, the schemata, the world knowledge they have, their discourse knowledge, the topical knowledge, looking at looking at some of the vocabulary, making sure that that's clear and can be used in context. Perhaps looking at some strategies, perhaps even if getting them to read the first couple of paragraphs and then doing the rest for homework. It depends on your students, right? But you and I think we've all been students. If someone gave me a large bit of reading, unless it's a really clear purpose, you know, I would at least focus on a couple of paragraphs just to whet the appetite, really, just to get them a little bit interested. But certainly, you know, they have to go home with the reading with a massive goal, not just read pages 6 to 18. That's just not the way to do it. There's a reason we need pages 6 to 18 and have a few questions or a few challenges in there. At least give them a reason to read, because the only time we don't have reasons to read and listen are in a classroom. In the real world, that doesn't exist.
So there's about the structuring, and then of course, even with reading for pleasure, there's a reason, which is pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Avoid work, Mark.
There are a number of questions here, so I'm struggling to read them on the small screen. I'm looking at the bigger screen. There are several questions about, I mean, there's one question here which says that even at C2 level, my students sometimes find it very difficult to answer questions, even if they understand the text.
Right.
Why might that be? And is there an approach to that? Perhaps it's about their wider knowledge, perhaps is what it is.
It's even a first language. This has nothing to do with foreign language. I've taught at university for many years before I moved into the council. And I've always been shocked at how students, even native language students, can read text and not understand it. Yeah, and again, it's the problem is it could be attention, and it could be the working memory. They might not be used to reading long texts or text of that length, And also it's the attention, even if it's a relatively short, it's the attention they're actually focusing on the short text. So the idea of working memory is you've got to be able to hold the text in your head, right? And then as you go along reading the next bits in the text, that bit of that text has to then add to that bit you've already got in your head, and then it goes into a slightly bigger bit, okay? And the idea is we build up that mental representation. But if I can't be bothered, or if I'm getting a bit bored, or I'm not quite sure why I'm doing it, or there's no real purpose or something, then it is very difficult for me, even in the first language. We all do it though. Sometimes we read something and we realize that we haven't understood a word of it because our mind's thinking of something else, right? So it is, going back to the reader characteristics, it is about either the cognitive, the attention memory, or the affective, the interest. If going back to the cognitive processes, it could be that they can't, as you said, they don't know much about the topic to make those links so they stick, yeah? Or going back to the text, for some reason they're not, that the text is too many things at once or not very structured well, and they're just sort of losing. I mean, when I read, you know, a couple of the texts that the other teachers sent me, fantastic, but I lost the plot sometimes because I couldn't work out what was happening. So it's not about their linguistic level. There's a lot going on in reading. Reading is about thinking. It's a real sort of, you've got to be really active, and you've really got to be on the ball. You know, unless you're reading a detective novel and you can sort of like skip most of the words, you've really got to, reading for information, you've got to be on the ball.
Even with a detective novel, though, if you can't work out what's going on, it can often be a bit of a shock. And obviously what's also true, as I'm finding out, is as you get older, the whole issues around memory become different. We've got questions about vocabulary and about approaches to new vocabulary. One question here says, how can we approach new vocabulary, presumably new vocabulary in text, to make high school students engage? And there's another question which is about translation. So I'm guessing it's translation of vocabulary questions, about dealing with vocabulary. So I suppose there's a bigger, broader question here, which is about, you know, texts which are full of words that students don't know.
Yeah, vocabulary is a huge issue. Because theoretically, if we know from first language in terms of, you know, early to child literacy, we know that they have to see that word in multiple contexts and multiple times for them to internalize that. And then even as we get older, that word may change, and then we have to add that to our knowledge. So if they're seeing a word for the first time, you have this additional issues, obviously. Now, the question, first of all, is why are you pre-teaching the vocabulary? Does it have anything to do with the purpose? You know, there was one of the texts, it talked about changes have been implemented. Okay, the changes have been implemented. Now, I wouldn't need to really pre-teach the word implemented, because what else can happen with changes? So, you know, some words we might not need to teach because they're going to be pretty obvious in the context. But if we do pre-teach words, the idea is we get them to use it in another sentence. Now, it's like this idea of pre-teaching the Charles V. We talked about the indigenous civilizations in Americas. Writing that word on the thing, and then perhaps getting someone to give us a sentence, something that perhaps, you know, one of the main issues with the indigenous, for the, you know, what they know, whether the issues being that the indigenous population was obviously somewhat exploited, or they were attacked, or they were conquered, you know, whatever the sentence is, or they saw new technology, weapons, for example. So I don't know, but to use the vocabulary is going to be one way where it can be internalized. But just to pre-teach and vocabulary lists, we know that from second language teaching, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. Lists of vocabulary and getting them to go home and looking up in dictionaries doesn't work either. What I tell my husband, who's a terrible Spanish learner, is when he reads the text, he reads A1 books. Don't use the dictionary. Read the text. Try and guess, even if you have no clue what it means. By the end of the sentence or the paragraph, have a good guess and see. So I'm trying to build up his skill of actual guessing, because to be honest, reading is a series of guessing games. Now, someone said That's not me. I can't remember the name of someone, famous person, who said that, a reading expert. And that's exactly what reading is. As we read, we have to guess, predict, you know, reflect, and as we're going along. So to try to get them not to teach the vocabulary might be useful. Depends on the time.
I think that's right. And sometimes you guess and you get it wrong, but you work it out later that you've got it wrong because something else doesn't fit, and you go back and you do it again. I mean, again, these all come down to strategies. These all come down to, you know, the not focusing at the word level. And then, you know, as I often say, I used to say to students, you know, when you're reading, when you're listening, you're not just using your eyes and your ears, you're also using your brain. You know, so, you know, make the context clear. I mean, this is partly the strategies that we have to help students with, isn't it? You know, the context is this. What do you think this word might mean in this context? But of course, if you've not done any contextual work in advance, any preparation work, then, you know, that question is unfair because they haven't got a clue what they're reading or what. I think there are other questions, Vicky, but I'm conscious of the time. So I think if that's all right with you, I'm going to end that there. Thank you very much for the presentation, for the answering the questions in the detail that you have done afterwards. And I think for putting into a different sort of perspective, a lot of the work, a lot of the strategies, a lot of the lesson plans around reading that teachers already use, but giving us a context for why these are important and the need to spend time on these things. You know, the language, the level, the linguistic aspects of reading are an important part, but they're only one part and probably less important than all of the other cognitive-based strategies that you've been talking about. So thanks very much. And maybe we'll get you back again to talk about what you've learned from putting tests together about listening or speaking or writing, because I think, you know, there's something perhaps for all of us in all of these things. Thanks. I think we have a slide, Maureen, in the background there, which we can show to say what we're coming next. So, as we said at the beginning, this is one of two webinars that we have prepared at the moment for secondary and around reading and literacy. The follow-up will be on the 24th of March, developing literacy by putting literature at the heart of planning in secondary, and will reflect much more on the approaches we're taking, if you like, to using text within the programme, but with all of the things that we've covered with Vicky today as very much part of the background to that, which is why we wanted to do this session first. So I think that's it. I've been asked to remind you to complete the survey that will be sent out or is already available, I'm not sure which, that you will find that we'll send you, and this will be about whether you want those sort of further webinars that I just mentioned, perhaps on looking at listening skills, writing skills, speaking skills. And Anne has just posted that, I think, in the chat, so you can see the survey there. Thanks very much to all of you for coming. Thank you for the people behind the scenes. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with another webinar. Until then, stay well, stay safe, and have a nice evening. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, bye-bye, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.